All right, welcome everyone. In this explainer, we're diving into one of the most massive, absolutely world-altering shifts in human history. We so often think of the Industrial Revolution as just this straightforward story about steam engines and textile mills, but it was so much more than that. It was literally the ultimate disruptor. It didn't just build factories, it completely restructured global economies, it shattered old social classes, and it basically built the very foundations of the modern political arguments that we're still having right now. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll track the global industrial spread, look at the new classes and conflicts that emerged from it, and then unpack the big ideological reactions: classical liberalism, socialism and Marxist communism, and finally, the Communist Manifesto. Okay, Section 1. The global industrial spread, the unstoppable wave beyond Britain. Now, the spread of industrialization, it wasn't just some slow trickle, it was a global shockwave. And this brilliantly illustrates that speed. Belgium jumps right in during the 1820s, and by the 1840s, it's hitting France and the German states. Then, check out the late 19th century. It is an absolute acceleration. Following the American Civil War in 1865, the U.S. economy just kicks into high gear. Almost at the exact same time, in 1868, Japan begins its Meiji Restoration. And by the 1890s, the wave finally crashes into Russia. So we're looking at a truly global phenomenon playing out over the course of a single century. But here's what's really fascinating. The spread wasn't just a simple copy-paste of the British model. Local conditions totally dictated entirely different paths. For instance, in the United States, industrialization was famously fueled by an abundance of resources and a massive internal market. But crucially, it was financed by the agricultural productivity of enslaved labor, whose cotton directly fed those northern mills. That unique, brutal combination actually propelled the U.S. to surpass Britain in output by 1900. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan, they took a much more state-directed approach. Germany leaned heavily into science and government investment, which sparked this massive second industrial revolution in chemicals and steel. Japan, feeling the very immediate threat of Western imperialism, deliberately directed its own modernization. They hired foreign experts, built state factories, and eventually privatized them into these massive conglomerates known as zaibatsu. It was so effective that Japan actually shocked the globe by defeating Russia in 1905. And speaking of Russia, their path was arguably the most volatile of the bunch. Relying heavily on foreign capital and a newly freed serf population that was suddenly flooding into the cities, well, they ended up creating a massive pressure cooker of social tension. Moving right along to Section 2, new classes, new conflicts, the societal fracture. So because no matter what national path a country took, the result everywhere was this fundamental fracturing of society into two camps. Let's look at the primary beneficiaries of this new system first, the bourgeoisie. Now, in Marxist political analysis, this is the class that owns the means of production. We're talking the factories, the machinery, the capital itself. Broadly speaking, this was the urban, middle, and upper middle class, the merchants, the manufacturers, the professionals, the financiers. They were the ones who truly dominated 19th century economies and, increasingly, its politics. They absolutely thrived on the expansion of market capitalism. But right across the factory floor was the complete other side of the coin. The industrial proletariat. These were the wage laborers. They didn't own capital. They literally only had their own labor to sell. And in these early industrial days, the conditions they faced were largely miserable. Unbelievably long hours, highly dangerous machinery, cramped and crowded urban slums. This glaring, stark contrast between the wealthy bourgeoisie and the struggling industrial proletariat, that became the absolute powder keg for the ideological responses that would define the modern world. Which brings us to Section 3, classical liberalism and markets, defending the new system. Now, what's really interesting about this is seeing the intellectual defense of this new reality. Thinkers like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill argued that industrial capitalism was actually a tremendous engine for human progress. They advocated strongly for free markets and private property, relying on the invisible hand of competition. Now, granted, that invisible hand probably wasn't very comforting if you were working a 14-hour shift, but because of this belief, they argued for minimal government interference. They generally opposed tariffs, guild rules, and even early labor regulations. Their core argument was that even if the wealth wasn't distributed equally right off the bat, the sheer economic growth of a free market would eventually benefit absolutely everyone through cheaper goods and rising wages. And it is important to note here, this wasn't purely about economics. They also championed civil liberties, freedom of the press, and constitutional government. On the flip side, we have Section 4, socialism and Marxist communism, the push for collective ownership.
So the crucial point here is just how night and day these two worldviews are. On one side, you have classical liberalism focusing on the individual, free markets, private property, limited government. And directly opposing that, you have socialism, which looks at the collective. Socialism argued that the means of production shouldn't be privately owned at all, but rather collectively owned. The entire goal was the equitable redistribution of all that amazing new industrial productivity, placing a really heavy emphasis on workers' rights over owners' profits. Now, the socialist response didn't just pop into existence fully formed. It evolved over time. Step one was what we call utopian socialism. You had these really fascinating figures like Robert Owen and Charles Fourier, who actually went out and tried to build experimental cooperative model communities. They wanted to prove, in the real world, that there was a viable alternative to cutthroat competitive capitalism. But step two took things much, much further. This is where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels enter the picture, developing what they called scientific socialism. Instead of just building isolated utopian factories, they essentially attempted to create a systemic, historically grounded theory of how the entire world worked.
And central to their theory was this concept of historical materialism. Marx impartially argued, using the economic logic of his day, that human history isn't just some random series of events. It is driven entirely by class struggle over resources. In his view, capitalism wasn't the end of history at all. It was just a specific, temporary phase. He argued that capitalism was fundamentally unstable, packed with internal contradictions that would inevitably, almost mathematically, result in a revolution. And the endpoint of that revolution? A classless communist society completely free of exploitation.
All right, Section 5. The Communist Manifesto, the bombshell of 1848. This was published right as massive revolutionary uprisings were literally sweeping across Europe, from France to Prussia to Italy, and the manifesto opens with what has to be one of the most famous lines in political history. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. This phrasing is just brilliant because it perfectly captured the exact mood of the era. It captured the deep, pervasive anxiety and terror felt by the European elites, while simultaneously voicing the massive, undeniable aspirations of the emerging socialist movements. Marx and Engels looked at the vast sweep of history, freeman and slave, lord and serf, and argued that the modern bourgeois epoch was different. Why? Because it had simplified everything. As they wrote, society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, bourgeoisie and proletariat. They painted this picture of a direct, uninterrupted, binary fight to the finish between the owners and the workers. But as powerful as that binary framing is, as an analytical tool, we really have to ask ourselves, what does this perfectly simplified model leave out? I mean, when you reduce all of human experience down to just the urban factory owner versus the urban wage laborer, where do small business owners fit into that? What about the millions of rural peasants, like the ones in Russia? What about the massive, largely uncompensated reality of women's labor? Or the millions of colonized subjects around the globe whose resources were actively feeding this whole system? It is a powerfully focused lens, for sure, but arguably it's a very Eurocentric, heavily industrial one. Despite those limitations, though, these three frameworks, all born directly from the smoke and the noise of the early factory floor, they essentially set the geopolitical game board for the entire next century. You've got classical liberalism, the ideology of free markets and the bourgeoisie. You have broader socialism, pushing for working class rights and redistribution, and you have Marxist communism, predicting the revolutionary collapse of the entire capitalist system. That exact ideological clash would go on to define everything from the 1917 Russian Revolution all the way through the decades of the Cold War. Let's move to how this builds into our world today, because history isn't just about the past, right? It's a mirror. The Industrial Revolution disrupted traditional life so intensely that humanity had to invent entirely new political ideologies just to cope with it. So I'll leave you with this to think about. If today's technological revolutions, like AI and global automation, are disrupting our society just as much as those very first factories did, what new political ideologies are being written right now? What is the specter haunting our current century? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.